Organised. So let me introduce you to the great Ben Habib.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you, Jeff, for that wonderful and kind introduction, and thank you all for giving up your Friday evening to hear what I have to say. I'm flattered and surprised that you would do that, but thank you. I'm delighted that this is going to be principally questions and answers, because I think that's a much more interactive way, for us to spend the evening, and probably more elucidating for you than just hearing what I have to say. How many in the room have actually heard me speak, at all or at length? When I get going, I do speak at length. So most of you kind of know my views. I think just to set the scene, perhaps, I should start by saying that there is no such thing as far right. It's a very convenient term used by the Prime Minister and others who are not of our political persuasion to discredit us. And there's no such thing as right-wing either, in my view, anymore. The schism in politics is not between the left and the right. The schism in politics, as convenient as the left might want to, or those who profess to be on the left, might wish to conveniently draw that difference. But actually the real divide in politics is between those of us who believe in our country, want our policies made by government to promote, protect and advance our own country, and those who are basically governing with global principles at heart. And the way we've been governed ever since really John Major took office. Margaret Thatcher, I think, was basically a nationalist like we are. But ever since John Major took office, and every subsequent Prime Minister, including every single Conservative Prime Minister, and I include Boris Johnson amongst them, by the way, have been globalists. They have believed that the prosperity of the United Kingdom is best served through some kind of global prism, through cooperating with international bodies, being members of international bodies, using international law to ensure that our own domestic democracy is basically watered down and we have much less control of how we govern ourselves. And there may have been a time and a justification for that approach to governance. After World War II, nation states were taken with a bit of a pinch of salt, because nation states had done some pretty bad stuff. Not the United Kingdom, but across the channel there are a few nation states that didn't behave themselves. And so we needed things like the European Convention of Human Rights, and we needed some kind of cooperation, the UN, to try and hold the world in peace. But that pendulum has swung far too far over towards globalism. And nation states and British citizens, as far as I'm concerned, in this nation state, are being trounced. And the net result of that is that we are seeing effectively the end of nation states in the West, and I think actually, if we're not very careful, the end of Western civilization. The threats that we face are of an existential nature. If we don't recognize what they are, if we don't swing that pendulum back from globalism towards nationism, we're going to be in real trouble. And the penny seems to be dropping across Europe. We're seeing votes for Geert Wilders, for example, in the Netherlands. We're seeing in Austria what they again term as a far-right party, but they're just nationists, coming to the fore. Hopefully we might see it in Germany. The German government just fell. And the outlier is apparently the United Kingdom, because we've just elected a globalist bunch of idiots into office. But I don't think we should be despondent by their massive majority, because the vote share that they got in the 2024 general election, the number of votes they got, was actually down from 10.3 million in 2019 to 9.7 million in 2024. They got that thumping majority for two reasons. One, and principally because the turnout for the election was very low. In 2019, 67.5% of the electorate turned out. In 2024, 59.5% turned out. And people like to describe that reduction in people voting as apathy. People were gripped by apathy. I think it's much worse than that. People aren't gripped by apathy, they're gripped by despondency, because they voted in 2016 for Brexit, they didn't get it. They voted for Theresa May in 2017, just about, to try and deliver Brexit, we didn't get it. They voted for Boris Johnson, who said he would get Brexit done. How many of you think he got Brexit done? He didn't. Brexit is unfinished work. And actually, sorry, I'll just complete this point. So in this general election, people were gripped by this despondency, and it was a pox on all their houses. And Reform UK had made fantastic inroads, but of course we hadn't penetrated completely people's psyche. And the narrative that a vote for Reform UK would either split the Conservative vote or is a wasted vote, I think did take root to some extent. And people didn't really have the confidence in voting for Reform UK. That concern, I think, has been put paid to. We've now got 5 MPs. I remember every news channel I went on, this is probably turning out to be more than 5 minutes, every news channel I went to in the lead up to the general election, people would say to me, well, you're just a spoiler. And I went on with one Conservative who said he would eat his underpants if we got a single MP. And I've had words with him, but he's refused to do what he said he would. And we've got 5 MPs, and now they say you've only got 5 MPs. Well, you know, we got 4 million votes. The Liberal Democrats got 3.7 million votes. They got 72 seats, we got 5 seats. 4 million plays 3.7, 5 MPs, 72 MPs. And the knee-jerk reaction to that, and I think the wrong reaction, is to think that we need to change the voting system. We don't. What we need to do is use the first past the post system, the way the Lib Dems have, and play the system so that when it comes to the 2029 general election, we concentrate in all those constituencies, and by the way, there were 98 in which we came second. We were a smidgen away from having 103 MPs. A smidgen away from having 103 MPs with our 4.1 million votes. We've got to play our cards cleverly. And I'm against PR because actually PR dumbs down your ability to do that which you wish to once you've been elected. And this country needs a 180-degree change in direction. We won't be able to do that through proportional representation. We need a reform kind of government in 2029 with unfettered ability to do that which is needed. And I think it is game on. It is absolutely game on. Don't give in to the narrative that we can't do it because we've only got 5 MPs, we only got 4 million votes. We will get many more votes, we'll be much richer, we'll know how to play the game, and we will make a massive dent into Parliament in 2029. Even if we don't form the next government, we will be a significant player. And of course, and I'll just quickly wrap up and then we can go to questions. Of course, what we've now got, which is terrific, is the biggest Western civilized country with a president that actually believes in the United States of America. And he is going to change the narrative. The narrative which was propagated and very happy, Biden would go along with any narrative probably. I saw a brilliant meme yesterday, 2 days ago, with a picture of Biden saying, "Have I won?" And, but we've got a president of the United States of America who's going to put the US first. There are going to be some adverse consequences for the UK as a result of him putting the US first, but it's a critical step in that direction. He is going to force Germany and France to put their, and indeed the UK, to put our hands in our back pockets and stump up for NATO and make sure that we are spending on defence, which we haven't done. We fudge our figures to get to the 2% of GDP spend that we're obliged to. Germany doesn't do it, France doesn't do it. The only country other than us in Europe that actually meets its NATO obligations is Greece. And that's because it's got such a small economy. Any amount of spending on defense meets its NATO obligation. So we need Trump to force us to build our defenses. I hope Trump will also, and we can talk about this in greater detail during question and answers, which I think is absolutely critical. I hope Trump will also say, if you want to be members of NATO, you can't be a member of the European Defence Union. You can't be a member of permanent structured cooperation, which is basically the formation of an army under Brussels. We've got to step away from that. So I think even though there will be challenges, and trade's not going to be as easy as it was because tariffs are going to be imposed on the UK, there's going to be a massive shift in narrative at the UN and other places away from globalism towards nationism. And so I'm actually, for the first time, last week I did a News at Ben. I don't know if anyone watches News at Ben on a Sunday morning. I was extremely depressed doing News at Ben last week. And I thought I would have sent all my listeners off to a very depressed Sunday lunch. But this week, I think the world and Western civilization in particular can breathe a sigh of relief. There is some hope.
Okay, thank you very much. Just on your right, Anne.
Hi, my name is Stephen Rumsby, and hi, Ben.
Stephen.
Yeah, on what you were just saying about the trade, one concern that I think we would like to know the answer to is, or your opinion on, obviously under Biden and the Democrats, we were never going to get a trade deal as we're out of the EU. Is it more likely now that we can strike a deal with Trump, in your opinion, as he is the self-proclaimed master of the deal? Will there be strings attached to it, etc.?
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So I think it is a mistake to think that because Trump likes the United Kingdom that we're going to get any specifically favorable treatment. He absolutely despises the EU, so we can be confident he's going to give them a good kicking, and that's good for us, relatively speaking. But he will impose, if he imposes the 10% tariff that he says he's going to impose on global imports, it will affect the United Kingdom. I don't think we need to be too worried. We have a unique trading relationship with the US. It's more or less balanced. We export to the US pretty much as they export to us, and vice versa. It's a balanced trade relationship. Actually, they think, and this is a peculiarity of the way the numbers are put together, they think they run a small surplus with the UK, and we think we run a small surplus with the US. So we both think we've got the better end of the deal. And the 10% tariffs, we would obviously levy them back in return. So I think, given that we have a balanced trading relationship, I don't think we need to worry too much about the tariffs. I'm not a great believer in trade deals. The World Trade Organization rules have advanced dramatically over the last 30 or 40 years. This notion that you need a trade deal for trade to happen is, I think, a flawed notion. What you really need is something worth having to sell that someone else in another country wishes to buy. And what we need to focus on in order to be nimble on the international trading scene is our domestic policies, which allow British businesses to produce goods, produce services and goods that other countries want. So, without wishing to dwell on any specific areas too much, one area that we've done nothing for since we left the EU, and on which we're not fettered by the EU, because we didn't get a trade deal with the EU, thankfully, on it, is financial services. We're still very, very highly regulated in financial services. And what we should be doing in financial, which is our biggest export, single biggest export, what we should be doing is deregulating financial services. I don't know if you've noticed, a lot of companies are bypassing London now to list in the United States of America. Companies like Arm, that are British companies, are choosing not to list here, but to go to the US. And that's because there's a dearth of capital available in the UK because we're over-regulated and badly regulated. What we need to do is make our domestic economy, we need to do what Trump's going to do in the US, cut taxes, cut regulations, and supercharge our domestic economy. We will then produce the goods that other people want to buy, and our trade with the world will grow. We don't need trade deals.
Good evening, John Austin is my name. Can you tell me why, since our excellent result at the general election, Nigel Farage hasn't been more front and centre and made much more political capital out of the faux pas and cock-ups that the present government is doing? It would seem to me the opportunities to put the boot in, as it were, are being lost by Nigel, and he needs to be a bit more positive in, well, generally slagging off the mess that the Labour Party are making. In the the council elections coming up, Reform has an excellent chance, I think, of completely changing the way the government is run by dominating local council elections, and then the local councils can then start making or refusing to do some of the things government says. I know it sounds a bit like anarchy, but I do believe that we need to, I was going to say, enforce and increase the police pay and the armed forces, because I think there's going to be trouble ahead, and we need to be ready.
Thank you very much. Two questions there.
Yeah, one of the great things about no longer being in the leadership is I can speak more freely. And Terry, on the way here, asked why we didn't have, why effectively we didn't have a shadow cabinet. And I don't know why we don't have a shadow cabinet. 6 months after Nigel's taken over, we should have a shadow cabinet. We should have spokespeople for all the disciplines that the Conservative Party have a shadow cabinet for, and the Labour Party sadly have a cabinet for. We should have those people coming forward. And the only explanation I've got is that the professionalising of the party is what is occupying Zia Yusuf and the other leadership, producing creating the branch structures, making sure that they've got appropriate candidates for the May elections. A lot of focus, by the way, is going in on the May elections. There's a lot of focus on getting candidates and good candidates for that, and I hope that succeeds. But we do need, if I were to be critical, we need to move at a faster pace than an oil tanker. We need to be like a speedboat. And so I would implore Zia Yusuf and Nigel to get on with the democratization of the party, which, by the way, still hasn't taken place, and speeding up the professionalization of, for which I read, creating branch structures, getting policies in place, having a policy unit. We desperately need a policy unit, and having fantastic candidates coming forward. And your second question was on policing up. Absolutely. I mean, I hope that Trump is going to lead the way. First of all, we build our defenses, we rediscover the quaint notion of borders, maybe, decide that we may protect our borders, develop a border force that actually does its job rather than acts as a taxi service. All these things are critical to the well-being of this country. And I'm sure we all saw what happened in Amsterdam yesterday. That was nothing to do with the footy. It wasn't, a typical English bunch of guys kicking off with another lot of English guys because they lost a game of footy. This was Palestinians targeting Jews because there was a Jewish football team playing. And I think some very serious harm was perpetrated yesterday. If we think that's not going to happen in the UK, we are labouring under a very sad illusion. What we see in Europe, what we see in France, the kind of interethnic violence that we're seeing emerging in Europe, which is as a result of unbridled legal and illegal migration, is going to be here very, very soon. And we do need stronger police, but I think what I would prefer to see is dealing with the problem at its root cause, which is getting rid of the massive immigration that we have and actually tilting towards net emigration and repatriating people. There should be mass deportation of anyone who's entered this country illegally, of which, by the way, did you know there are nearly 1 million people in this country who are here illegally? There should be no right for anyone in this country who's here illegally to stay. And if that requires leaving the ECHR, changing our domestic laws, repealing the Human Rights Act, we should do all of that. And again, and this is where the chair comes from, we'll be able to take more of a lead now from the US. Trump's already declared he's going to be very strong on borders, very strong on the NSA. He's going to root out members of the NSA who are not doing their jobs. He's going to root out bureaucrats who don't put the US first. He's made that speech. I don't know if anyone saw that. It was a very heartening speech. And we can take our lead from Trump.
There was another aspect to that question about winning seats at the local election and thereby creating a type of undercurrent of opposition at a local level. Now, I mean, I know a lot of work has gone in by central government to stop this sort of thing, but do you think that's a possibility?
I think it's absolutely critical that reform succeeds in producing, converting its grassroots movement from being a grassroots movement into having representation on parish councils, local councils, district councils, etc. Because it'll be through that process that we get our agenda right across the country, and it'll be through those people we will get our future MPs.
Good evening. My name is Tom Gillett. Thank you very much, Ben, for coming down to Dorking this evening. The recent election of Kemi Badenoch as the leader of the Tory party, do you think that may in any way undermine Reform's future? Is she likely actually to recover the votes that the Tories have frankly lost to Reform?
Okay. So Kemi has a devil's job. I don't know, I think it's very hard to know what Kemi really thinks because she did a fantastic job of obscuring it during the leadership election. We saw a phenomenal Damaskene conversion of Robert Jenrick from a floppy-haired, slightly plump, Remain voting, Theresa May supporting, sort of wet, to someone who'd cropped his hair into a Tommy Robinson haircut, was on for mass deportations, would leave the ECHR at the drop of a hat, and was actually, I don't like the term, further right than anyone in Reform, with the exception perhaps of me. But I think Robert Jenrick would have been more challenging for Reform, and actually I would have welcomed that challenge because it would have kept Reform on its toes. As much as we all love each other and our leadership, it's quite good to have tension between our competitors, and our competitors are the Tory party. It would appear to me, at first glance, that Kemi is not going to be a challenge for Reform. Her shadow cabinet, and she may have no option here, of course, but her shadow cabinet includes a lot of people that we would all regard as wet. Crucially, the two people she put in charge of CCHQ, their central office, are two Remainers, a guy called Nigel Huddleston and Lord Johnson. They're both Cameroonian, David Cameron supporters. They're weak, they're wet. And where the Tory party is facing its biggest threat, believe it or not, having been given a good kicking, a deserved kicking in Parliament, where they're facing their biggest threat right now is the loss of their membership and the inability for them to get proper candidates coming through to stand for councils and as MPs. You may be aware that the Tory party had 2.8 million members in 1950. It had 170,000 members when Liz Truss stood to be Prime Minister. It now has, according to the latest disclosure, 130,000 members and slipping because after Kemi was made leader, their numbers went down and our numbers went up. The Conservative Party is facing an existential threat. And what Kemi needs to recognise is that, if she's listening, Kemi, this is what you need to do. What she needs to recognise is that the threat to the Conservative Party is not from the Lib Dem side of politics. The threat to the Conservative Party is failing to recognise that the voter turnout went down because Boris Johnson didn't get Brexit done, because they're not a nationalist party, and that what they've got to do is outcompete Nigel Farage and Reform. That's where she's got to put herself if she's going to present any form of, any prospect of the Conservative Party recovering. And early signs are not promising.
Good evening, Mr. Habib. My name's Barry. I'm looking ahead to the next general election, maybe 5, possibly 2 years hence, and Reform are the next government. What are you going to do with the civil service and the institutions which are going to do their best to bring you down?
Okay. It is a Trumpian answer. It is, the lead has been set for us. So the civil service can't defeat governments. You know, let's just be clear on this. It's very helpful for governments, like they used to, blame the EU. Oh, it's the EU's fault. It was an EU directive, an EU regulation. Not us, mate. As soon as we left, we didn't really leave, but as soon as we kind of technically left, the EU, then I say it's the civil service. It's the blob. It's this amorphous nothingness over which we cannot exercise any control. That is not true. The Conservative government, I think, couldn't exercise control over the civil service because the Conservative government was a split government. They had nationists amongst them, the ERG and others. They had 5 families, I think. I can't remember all the 5 families, but the ERG was the principal nationalist, and they had the globalists. And they knew that if they saw Priti Patel off from the Home Office, or they saw Suella Braverman off from the Home Office, they'd get a wet at some point, and they'd be able to. So it was like children playing their parents off against each other. Trump was very clear this morning, and you know, he came out and he said the bureaucrats are going to be turfed out. And what reform has to do, and that's why PR is not good, proportional representation not good, because we would have to share government with people with whom we disagree, and we would have to temper ourselves, and the civil service would then have the ability to run us ragged. We need a majority reform UK government, so we can walk into the offices of government, and the civil service will be shivering in their shoes, because they will see a unified entity governing the country that will not be split, that is unified in its views of what needs to be done, and we will fire people. It's just simple governance. There are last time I looked was a couple of years ago, so it's probably more now, but 2 years ago there were 491,000 people working in the civil service. An absolute disaster. Slash them, you know, we should have a sort of divided in two policy.
I'm a retired farmer, so I'm not going to go on about that. My number one gripe is this immigration. Just does my head in. I want to ask you, what is your opinion of Tommy Robinson? I've seen the video on YouTube, and I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, so I think the immigration question was the first question, wasn't it? So immigration has to be, frankly, since I'm no longer deputy leader, I don't think we're strong enough on immigration as a party. I think we have to be stronger. We have to declare, as I declared, my own personal view that all people in this country who are here illegally should be deported. There should be no exception, and that is basically mass deportation. There should be schemes for repatriation of those who are here legally. There should be encouragement for people to leave this country who are not British citizens. I would ban dual citizenship too. If you want to be British, give up all your other passports. You be British. There's no justification to have, you know, a Pakistani passport alongside your British passport. The other crucial thing for immigration, it's a slight tangent, but absolutely critical, is we must abolish, you would have heard me speak about this ad nauseum on GB News and Talk Radio, is we must abolish diversity, equity and inclusion. All the regulations around it. That has given protected status to immigrants, effectively. Protected status to ethnic minorities, religious minorities, minority sexual preferences, the whole transgender ideology. And I'm just going to develop one, since you've asked the question, just a slight tangent. The Jewish community should benefit from DEI. I went to the north of London and I talked about the need to, I was addressing a Jewish community, and I said DEI needs to go, and I was expecting a massive round of applause. And I was criticized for it because the Jewish community see themselves as being protected by DEI because they themselves are a minority. But what they haven't picked up on, and it's a really important fine detail about DEI that we need to take on board, is that when you give this group of people that I described ethnic minorities, religious minorities, minority sexual preferences, transgender ideology, protected status. They are all protected from us, but in the protected status lot, none of them are protected from each other. Now, it's a curious thing that Sadiq Khan, who is a Muslim, bats for LGBTQ plus causes. The reason he bats for LGBTQ plus causes is because he's part of that protected, they are traveling together as a group at the moment. But when one group becomes exceptionally dominant within the protected status, that group will run the entire protected status group. Do you see where I'm going with this? So when you have a group like the pro-Palestinian lot, who are the majority within the protected status, they will run ragged. They're protected from us, the majority. We can't challenge them. And they're the strongest group in the protected status bracket. So they will run everyone else ragged. We don't have a two-tier policing system. We have a two-tier society. We have a complete, at every level. When you look at prospects to go to university, prospects to get a job, prospects to get a promotion, prospects to join the armed forces, prospect to get a job in the public service, prospect of being arrested, prospect of being convicted, you are much, much less likely to be challenged. If you're in the protected status group, you're much more likely to be promoted and celebrated. If you're a white, middle-aged man, a heterosexual one at that, you are going to be prejudiced against. You've got a real issue in this country as a white, middle-aged, heterosexual man. So we've got to get rid of that nonsense. So that's the immigration thing. You know, we've got to be much more positive on immigration, repatriation of people who shouldn't be here. And we've got to make our own labour force work. There are 6 million people in this country who are surviving on universal credit. That's 20% of our workforce. 20% of our workforce. 2.3 million out of that 6 million are not even looking for a job. And the reason they're not looking for a job is because cheap imported labour has pulled the rug out from under their ability to earn a fair wage. And if they were to get a reasonable wage, it's taxed to hell. And taxes has just gone up on the working class. Remember, he said he wouldn't target the working class. Employers' NI, the threshold at which it's levied, has dropped from £9,000 per annum to £5,000. That's an extra 600 quid per head for the working class. You think the rich give a damn about that? Not at all. It's going to hit the working class. So we need a positive policy for our own labour as well, so that we can cope with the de-immigration that we need to have happen. Sorry, that's a very comprehensive answer to your first question. Second question, on Tommy Robinson. We are very quick on our side of the political spectrum, those of us who believe in this country. We're very quick to damn people. We allow the mainstream media to vilify people, and once they're vilified, we're very nervous to support them. And we have to get over that nervousness. I don't know Tommy Robinson. I don't know him, but I'm not going to throw Tommy Robinson under a bus. Tommy Robinson has his own style. It's a style that I wouldn't use, I don't use, but he has made some very valid points. He revealed the Rotherham rape gangs. He brought to attention what's going on in Luton way before other people did. And I think we've got to have a more open-minded approach to those people who are clearly nationists like we are. And the last thing I'd just say on Tommy Robinson is that Tommy Robinson's lot are our lot. It's a critical mistake. No politician should insult the electorate. It's not a good policy. Finish Tommy Robinson. Yeah, I mean, they've vilified him, but it's the mainstream media. Look, I'm not an apologist for Tommy Robinson. As I say, I don't know him. He may do stuff that is bad, but I don't know him. And he's been vilified by mainstream media, which I know would seek to vilify all of us. Nigel's been on the receiving end of the mainstream media. We all know what they do. I didn't want to meet Nigel back in I was nervous of meeting Nigel in 2019 because my image of Nigel, having been just a businessman until 2019, was that he was a right-wing, racist, xenophobic fascist. And when I met Nigel, he was, surprisingly affable and easy to deal with. And they want to vilify us, and we've got to be slightly stronger in the positions we take and say, well, no, we're going to just question what the mainstream media is saying here.
Following up on that lot,
Yeah.
what did you make? When I saw the Richard Tice interview and the throwaway that lot, I got the impression that Richard Tice was just rather annoyed with the question and and it wasn't.
Yeah.
It looks terrible on paper, and I know a lot of Reform supporters and members took it badly.
I don't think, frankly, I don't think Richard had really thought it through. I think there is pressure. Let's just be honest here. There is a lot of pressure on people like Richard, Nigel, me, particularly Richard and Nigel and the other 3 MPs, less so on me. There's a lot of pressure to toe the line. There's a lot of pressure to go in the middle, because if you don't, you get taken apart. And what Nigel and Richard and others want to do, understandably, justifiably and thankfully what they wish to do, is deliver a government of Reform UK in 2029. So they're trying to toe a line which allows them to carry the votes that they need to carry in 2029 from across the country to deliver them into government. But, and so there's a propensity, I think, to throw some of our own aside. There's a risk that in the pursuit of appearing to be reasonable, we inadvertently throw some of our own aside. Are you with me? And I think there's a way to achieve all of it by expressing oneself in the way that I've just expressed myself, by saying that, we don't know Tommy Robinson, that he's a British citizen, that he's called out some important things, and that even though we may not champion, celebrate, and wish to, tie ourselves to Tommy Robinson's bandwagon, we're not going to throw him under a bus. And certainly people who like Tommy Robinson, who do know him, who do follow him, who know him better than I do, they vote Reform. There are voters.
Yes, you said that you would deport anybody who shouldn't be here, who's here illegally. But there's a problem if they throw their passports away and we don't know where they've come from. And if we do know they come from Afghanistan and Syria, would that be difficult to deport them back to those countries?
So I should have said detain and deport. Suella Braverman, when she put forward the Illegal Migration Act, do you remember the Illegal Migration Act? They said it was going to sort everything out. The initial draft said that anyone who enters this country illegally will be detained and then deported. If you can't, and I take your point, there are some people we will not be able to deport because we don't know where they come from and we don't have arrangements with those countries to deport them back to those countries. But then the detaining becomes vital. They've got to be detained. They can't be put in a 4-star hotel in Altrincham in the middle of did you read that story this morning? It was extraordinary. People were turfed out, had all their wedding plans cancelled. People were turfed out of the hotels because migrants were being put into the hotel. It was taken over yesterday. It was absolutely outrageous. And they have to be in prison. They've entered the country illegally. They have to be detained. And if they can't be deported, they stay in prison. But there's no solution better than enforcing our borders. That is what we have to do. We've got to... It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it, that Tony Blair had no problem committing British troops to Afghanistan for 22 years. He had no problem committing British troops to Iraq. No problem. David Cameron had no problem bombing Libya to smithereens, creating a failed state out of Gaddafi's Libya, however awful Gaddafi was. They had no problem inciting uprisings in Egypt. They nearly toppled the Saudi government and so on. They had no problem with all of that. but they have a problem with physical interventions at the point that people wish to enter the United Kingdom. Why are we so prepared to go and have foreign wars and kill people liberally abroad, but not prepared to protect our own borders? It makes no sense. And it makes no sense because actually these globalists are nutcases and they haven't got it. They seem to think that through some global arrangement, borders will become unnecessary. We'll be all kumbaya. We'll all love each other forever. We'll all be breaking bread together. And it's just racists and xenophobes who can't get their heads around the fact that the other 7.7 billion people in this world should all be welcome in the United Kingdom. I mean, that is literally how they think.
Russell Hicks. Ben, we all adore you. We think you're fabulous. That's why we're here.
Thank you.
So I think I know the answer to this question, but I would like to ask you, why didn't you win on July the 4th?
Okay, that's a really good question. I was staggered I didn't win on July the 4th. I mean, frankly, it's a very simple answer, actually. It just wasn't the right constituency. I hadn't appreciated it. There was a very strong, loyal Conservative vote, which I couldn't break into. And I hadn't appreciated how strong that loyalty was to the Conservative Party. I got 9,000 something votes. The Tory got 12,000 votes. And the Labour candidate got 17,000. And the Labour candidate got 13,000 in the by-election that I stood in before that. And she only went up 4,000 from the by-election to the general election. But I was absolutely staggered that there was quite a significant recovery in the Conservative vote once they'd got rid of Peter Bone's ex-girlfriend who stood in the by-election. Frankly, I was in the wrong seat. I completely agree, and it comes back to what Jeff was saying, and it's critical that we develop we win council seats, that we develop our ground game. But by the way, just in my own defence, I did a lot of door knocking, I did a lot of speeches in and around Wellingborough. It just wasn't going to work in 2024. It was just one of those things. James McMurdoch, who was the 5th MP, was effectively a paper candidate in Thurrock, and he wasn't even expecting to win. He didn't do any real campaigning, and he just won. And, it just goes to show. But next time, it's going to be a very different thing.
Hello, Ben. This is Richard Granville here. A short question. How can Reform UK persuade more people that the net zero mandate is a thoroughly bad idea?
So, Jeff straight away asked me, how's your science? And actually forgive me, Jeff, if you don't mind me saying so, I never tackle the question from a scientific perspective. Because once you get into debating the science, the science isn't settled, I'm not convinced by the science, I'm much more skeptical, I'm skeptical completely of the world's about to burn up narrative. But the minute you get into that debate, it's like debating whether God exists or not. You're not going to convert anyone. It's a religious belief. Some people think the world's going to burn up. Others are absolutely adamant it isn't. But what I can say, and I think what Reform does really well, is to illustrate how devastatingly bad that policy is. And what we've got to remember that is the following. The net zero policy by 2050 and the steps required to be taken by the United Kingdom between now and 2050 arbitrary. They've been decided not by God, not by the God of the climate. They've been decided by people sitting in the Paris Accord, bunch of Europhiles and Eurocrats and globalists who've taken a one-size-fits-all policy, and they've said the United Kingdom needs to be down to a certain percentage of its carbon outputs by 2030, a certain percentage by 2035, and so on. And the UK was already a very small relative emitter. So for us to get to these intermediate steps that we're obliged to under the Paris Accord is a very economically painful thing. Much more painful for us to decarbonise than it is for China to decarbonise, because they start from a really high level of carbon emissions. Much easier for the US to decarbonise than for us to decarbonise. Do you see what I'm saying? And what we've done, which only the British would do, and I speak in the third person here because I do not associate myself with this way of thinking, is instead of doing what the US did, and credit to Biden for this, what the US did was frack its way to fossil fuel independence and energy security. And then from a position of strength, they put in place that massive Inflation Reduction Act. Do you remember it? $375 billion, balmy number, to be spent on getting their carbon emissions down. So they became energy independent, energy producing, fossil fuel producing, and then started tackling net zero. What we've done is the other way round. We've switched off the North Sea before we had any renewables that could replace it, in the hope that we'd get there. It is absolutely balmy. And if that wasn't bad enough, you know, we've levied 78% tax on fossil fuel companies. I have friends in the fossil fuel sector. They are simply not drilling or extracting gas because it's not worth their while to do it in the North Sea. They talk about whether the government's giving new licenses out for it. No one's seeking new licenses. No one wants to do it because it's not worthwhile. So what we need to make clear to the British people is that it's costing, Richard Tice estimates the figure at 35 billion a year. I actually think it's more like 50 or 60 billion a year. That's what net zero is costing us. That's what it's costing the taxpayers. In my view, 50 to 60 billion pounds a year. For nothing in return. For the impoverishment of the British people, for a knee on the neck of the working class, so that the working class can't drive their white vans and their fully depreciated cars to work and back cost effectively, because they'll be penalised under ULEZ and under all the tariffs that they have to pay because they've got this car, damaging our ability to work, justifying the need therefore for immigrants, and the whole thing goes round in circles. And, you know, we talk about not having enough housing. Housing costs have gone through the roof because every new development you do now has to comply with net zero. And do you know what one of the biggest problems is in new housing? It's mold. And do you know why mold grows so well in new housing? Because it's so bloody insulated, there's no air going through the houses. So it's a perfect environment for mold. And because of net zero, we're not investing in our already dilapidated and vacated town centres. We should be converting all that vacant office space in town centres to residential. But we won't do it because none of those buildings will easily comply with the net zero regulations. So we're building on green fields, damaging the farming sector, putting solar panels on the green fields, and turning our backs on our town centres, which are in desperate need of revitalisation because of net zero. And so on, and so on, and so on. When you start a daft policy like net zero, which is so damaging, its consequences are not binary. Its consequences are manifold. They affect everything. And so we just need to debunk the whole net zero thing. The fear of the climate burning up, the earth burning up, and net zero are not synonymous. One is a government policy, which is daft. The other is just religious nutcases. And I can't tackle the religious nutcases. We can tackle the government policy.
Terry Moody. Hello again, Ben. I'm sure I speak for everybody here if I say that you're doing a great job. You go around the country a lot talking to groups of people like this one. We know you're on TV and radio a lot, and you're always promoting Reform UK, and I think most of us here would agree with almost everything you say. What interests me is, what I'd like to ask you is, what are your
future plans within reform? Where do you see yourself in a few years' time? And do you think you might put yourself forward for another parliamentary seat soon?
So I was deputy leader of reform, which meant that I had to toe the line. I now see myself as the conscience for reform, which puts me in a slightly more liberated position. And I can say things like, our lot, and I wouldn't throw certain people under the bus. And I can say things like, we should be mass deporting where we can. And I think these are important messages to get across. And, we can then debate them at a senior level and decide which of Ben Habib's crazy ideas are adopted and which are binned. But that's how I see my job at the moment, is setting the narrative as best I can. I think it is critical, I think it's absolutely critical that reform democratizes. I've made a big song and dance about it, and I'll continue to make a song and dance about it. It hasn't happened yet. I have to be frank with you, it hasn't. If you do a search at Companies House, as much as I love Nigel, he still owns Reform UK. And you can't can you imagine the headlines? You probably heard me say this on telly. But can you imagine the headlines if we win the 2029 general election and the next morning the FT comes out with, and the Wall Street Journal comes out with, Reform UK new government owned by Nigel Farage? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? So we've got to democratize. We've got to trust our own people. Democratization of the party, I think the reluctance to do it is a fear that it might all be taken over by entryists or swivel-eyed lunatics like Ben Habib. But we've got to trust our people. We've got to trust those people who vote for us, and we've got to democratize it. And so once it's democratized, and I'll keep making the case for its democratization, then I'd be absolutely delighted, desirous, and so on, to stand for a seat and to be in Parliament, sitting next to Nigel and Richard, and socking it to defending ourselves from the attacks of the opposition, because we'll be in government by then.
Ben, after the conference, they did announce some changes, some democratisation. I read a lot about it at the time, but I couldn't really fathom out what they'd done there. Could you outline what they have done so far?
Yeah, so who is familiar with the structure of the party? Hands up if you think you know, or hands up if you'd like me to tell you what the structure of the party is. Okay, so the structure of the party is a limited liability company. There are 15 shares in this limited liability company. 9 of them are owned by Nigel. 5 of them are owned by Richard Tice. And 1 of them is owned by a guy called Mehrtash Azami, who was the accountant and may still be the accountant. He was the accountant of the Brexit Party. So it's controlled by Nigel. The democratization, so what Nigel has promised is that the limited liability company, limited by shares, would be changed. He said converted. You can't actually legally convert, so I assume he meant changed, to a company limited by guarantee, if you know what I mean. And because it's limited by guarantee, then the members, all of us, would then be able to own that company, and it would become a genuinely widely held entity, and that would be the party. That would be the fundamental democratization of it. What was discussed at the at the conference was the constitution of the party, and the constitution of the party is the rules by which the party operates. It's a document which presumably will or already has been lodged with the Electoral Commission. It needs permission from the Electoral Commission for it to come into use. And that document is available online, and you can read it. And it basically says, it says a number of things, but it basically gives the right of the membership to remove the leader through the following process. 50% or more of the membership have to vote to have a motion of no confidence heard. And once the motion of no confidence is put forward, that motion of no confidence is determined by the board of directors of Reform UK. The board of directors will comprise, under the Constitution, 8 directors, 4 or 5 of which are appointed by the leader, and 3 are elected by the members. So you would have heard me be critical of the Constitution, because it's basically, it's a democratization where, in the pursuit of removing the leader, you've got to appeal to people who've been appointed by the leader. And so that's, slightly difficult. And it also doesn't have checks and balances in place. But it doesn't matter, as far as I'm concerned. I've made the case for democratization. We all agree it's required, don't we? We all agree. Do we all agree that democratization? Right. And as the party moves forward, the pressure for democratization will grow, and I'm sure that we will end up sometime before 2029 with a genuinely democratic party. Because if we don't, there is no prospect of winning the 2029 general election. We will be hammered by the press if in 2029 we're standing in a general election with a party owned by Nigel. We've got to make sure that democratisation takes place.
Hello, Alistair Gray. Farmers very much under attack on 2 fronts at least, and probably more. One is the inheritance tax, and the other is the threat of concreting over their farms, having solar panels, and drive farmers out of business, let big green come in, trash the country completely. There is a demonstration planned by the NFU, rather belatedly in getting in on things, a demonstration on the 19th, which I would very much like to go to, but I've just been informed that Her Majesty's government the police seek to limit that to 1,800 members of the NFU and no other people like ourselves, who will presumably be arrested as right-wing thugs and held as political prisoners in very brutal jails, as they are to the likes of us. What do you think of that, Ben?
I'm not aware that it's been limited. The NFU, by the way, voted Remain, just to give you the heads up on the NFU. But I'm not aware that there's been a limitation on numbers. I'm intending to be there on the 19th of November. It's Parliament Square, isn't it? I'm intending to be there, and I think a lot of people are intending to be there. So if it's been limited to 1,800, they're in for a shock.
Good evening, Mr. Habib, and thanks for coming down to give the talk today and answer our questions. Now, one of the things that I've been thinking all along, and I'm sure that quite a lot of Reform members and Brexit supporters in general have been thinking about this one. One of the problems why we've not been able to deport a lot of people who, too many people that we don't want in the country is because of the ECHR, and it's been so many people have talked about leaving the ECHR for some time, yet there's been no real action on it. And what I'm wondering is, in the 2029 election, if Reform were to put leaving the ECHR as one of their key election policy tickets, how easy would that be to mount an election campaign with that as like the centre point?
Okay, thank you. Well, I think Nigel is very, very strong on the ECHR. He has suggested a referendum on it. I would do as you're kind of intimating, which is make it an election point, and if it's in the manifesto and we get returned to government, we have the mandate to remove it. The problem with the ECHR is that it is embedded in the Human Rights Act. The European Convention of Human Rights has been embedded into British law through the Human Rights Act of 1998, and we made the European Court of Human Rights the supreme arbiter of human rights disputes in the United Kingdom. Here's a really interesting stat, which you would have perhaps heard me say on the radio, but in the period between 1959, when the European Convention was put into place and the court was formed, and 1995, when the ECHR reformed itself, in that 59 to 95, what is that, 36 years, is that right? Have I got that right? 36 years. there were 850 judgments by the European Court of Human Rights, thereabouts. Between 1995 and 2024, there have been 23,500 judgments by the European Court of Human Rights. And in 1995, the European Convention was reformed, and it was a requirement for member states to adopt the European Court into their own domestic legal frameworks. And it was as a result of the promotion that the European Court of Human Rights got in the 46 member states that it is members, of the Convention. It is as a result of that the European Court has gone out of control. And it knows that there's nothing we can do about it. It is the single, if you want an example of globalism gone wrong, the European Court of Human Rights is as good as any. It's a body that sits in Strasbourg. It's a black box. We know nothing about how they operate. We don't even know which judge has adjudicated the case. They just come out with their findings. They come out with their rulings. And we as a country have to adopt them. And there's no mechanism to challenge them. No mechanism. They're the supreme body. Now, the key is to have this reform majority through a first-past-the-post system so that we can do what we want to do, and to repeat. A lot of people, by the way, I've interrupted myself. A lot of people see the need to reform, and we call ourselves reform. Actually, one of the first things we've got to do when we get to government is not reform, but to repeal. We need to restore. We need to repeal just about everything Tony Blair did and take us back. And it'll be a cathartic process because we'll just be chucking stuff out. And one of the things we've got to repeal is the Human Rights Act of 1998. It is Blair did so many things in 98, like giving the Bank of England independence, like giving Ofcom more powers. And what he was doing was removing power from the people. There's an unsaid constitutional convention in the United Kingdom, and I'm sure you're aware of it, that no parliament can bind a successive parliament. Are you familiar with that concept? But of course, if you give power over to an international authority, or you sign an international treaty, that goes through parliament after parliament after parliament. And that's why he did it, because he could put the Blairism architecture in place and remove our ability as a nation state, as a democratic nation state, to remove our ability to remove that which he wanted to do. And so what we must do is repeal, 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 repeal. And coming back to the Kemi Badenoch question, she had a fantastic opportunity under the European Union Retained Law Act. Who's familiar with the European Union Retained Law Act? It was an act of Parliament put in place entitling the government to repeal EU regulations that are on our statute books. Now, at the risk of being boring, EU regulations are not something that our Parliament has debated. EU regulations were made in Brussels by the Commission, and they were foisted on member states, and when we were a member state, we took them verbatim. They're not directives which were debated in Parliament and then put into some kind of British form of law and implemented. Regulations came straight from Brussels, from the great and good at the top table in Brussels. And Kemi had the opportunity to repeal the 4,500 regulations which were not made with British interests in mind. They were made with Brussels' interests in mind, and she shirked it. I think she repealed maybe 400 or 500 of them. And she said, those of you who pay very close attention to what Kemi Badenoch's up to will know that she said that repealing those regulations would create a legislative vacuum. Do you remember she said that? The beauty about the United Kingdom, and something Kemi needs to read up on, is there's no ability in our form of law to have a legislative vacuum. The whole point about British law, the whole reason we succeeded as a globe-trotting imperial nation and people adopted our law across the world is because our law permits you to do whatever the hell you want unless it's expressly prohibited. The reason the Europeans haven't done so well, forgive me, Dorrit, the reason the European empires didn't do so well, the reason their law hasn't been adopted abroad is because nothing is allowed unless it's expressly permitted. It's a very restrictive. And so that's a very long answer to saying we've got to repeal, 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 and go back to that British form of law, which allows us to be independent, to think independently. You know, one of the reasons, I'm digressing, but I'm going to say it, one of the reasons we won World War II is because Anglo-Saxon way of thinking was different to the European way. They think in structured blocks. We think in a collage with our antenna all over the place, looking for solutions. And the same with the Americans. That's the Anglosphere. And that is one of the critical defining differences between the European model and the Anglo-Saxon model. And the Anglo-Saxon model works a hell of a lot better. But Kemi went down, she was trotting out EU language, a legislative vacuum. No, Kemi, no legislative vacuum.
Good evening. My name is Stanley Jackson. I stood for Parliament in 1987. I was a member of the old Liberal Party. I would normally be characterised as a classical Liberal, and I therefore agree with much of what you have said, although I would certainly not agree with all of it. But
really?
let's just
very sad.
let's just leave that aside, because I believe in a small state, a primacy of the individual, and I'm looking for reform to give me a taxation system which is fair and lower, and the one that I would like to see developed is the flat rate that I think is being proposed in Italy at the moment, and it was around about 10 years ago. There's no reason why we can't do that. What chance is there of reform producing that kind of policy?
Do you mean a flat rate of tax no matter what your earnings
Yes.
are? Everyone pays a flat rate of
Yes.
tax. So, I mean,
and
that's
you
going to be...
remove all the other taxes, by the way, including inheritance tax, capital gains tax, and so on.
Everyone just pays a flat rate, including
Yes.
corporations and everything,
Correct.
businesses. That would be a challenge, because that would be reinventing. I think, by the way, it's an admirable aim. I think a flat rate of tax is an admirable aim, because it simplifies the whole tax code. It makes it much more difficult to dodge your taxes, and everyone pays a rate. I think it's a very challenging thing to get to in one step. Reform, however, is basically a tax-cutting party, and when people say to me, you don't represent the working class, you represent the elite, you know, you're all a bunch of fascists. I mean, what I say, actually, is our signature economic policy is our tax policy for the working class, which is to increase, I'm sure you know this, increase the threshold at which income tax is paid from £12,500 per annum to £20,000 per annum, which would take 6 million people out of the tax net. That's how lowly paid British citizens are now. It would take 6 million people out of the tax net. And that would help also with the immigration, because if you can keep more of what you earn, you're more likely to work, more British people work, less need for immigrants. Are you with me? So, I mean, I read, one quick aside, I read the 1992 Liberal, was it the Liberal Democrat Party by 1992? But it was the Liberal Party manifesto in 1992. It read like a far-right manifesto compared to where the Conservative Party manifesto is nowadays. I mean, the Liberals have come a long, long way in a wrong direction, since then. Yeah.
Still be there.
Yeah.
But when I stood in Windsor and Maidenhead, by the way, and I was one of the things you had to do was to go to Eton and speak to the boys. And the first boy who got up to ask me a question was Jacob Rees-Mogg. I put him away, and I apologised afterwards to the person who would organise the meeting. And
I was told, well, please don't worry about it, nobody likes him anyway. So. But on a serious point, that was the old Liberal Party, and I stood as part of the alliance with the SDP as the other half of the alliance.
Yeah.
From that time onwards, of course, the Liberal Party lost its way, and ever since then we've had shades of Labour shades of whatever,
in all
including
parties.
the last one.
In all parties, yeah. Okay, one more question. Okay, right down here at the front. Here we go.
Kevin O'Leary, are the guys at head office likely to consider the possibility of the return of capital punishment sometime in the future?
The quick, frank answer is we haven't considered it, and it's not first and foremost, I don't think, on anyone's mind. I haven't considered it. We all describe ourselves as living in a liberal democracy, don't we? We all kind of just say this is the greatest liberal democracy in the world. Liberalism, and you just prompted me to say, liberalism has gone mad in this country. Liberalism, as you say, is the promotion of the individual's right. And liberalism played a fantastic role in the protection of the individual, the promotion of the individual, and in particular, the emancipation, obviously, of women and the equalizing of rights between men and women, welcoming women into the workplace and making sure they got the same wage for doing the same job and all of that. But liberalism, I think now, is basically undermining itself. It's got to a point now where the championing of the individual is so extreme that if, for example, you want to identify as a dog, you have every right to identify as a dog because that is your liberal right. It is your right as a human being to be whatever you wish to be. And it is that ideology that's become extreme that also gives rise to DEI. Because what DEI is basically saying is, it's wonderful that you're a Muslim. It's wonderful. You have a right to be a Muslim. And we will protect you, and we will celebrate your right to be a Muslim. And you can practice Sharia law in your communities, and you can wear the burqa if you want to, because that's perfectly legitimate within Islam, and we won't interfere with that. And similarly, we will say to people, if you want to identify as women, even if you're packing, you can go into a women's loo and you can urinate, sitting down or standing up or whatever it is, next to a woman. And in the pursuit of liberalism, we have actually undermined that which liberalism did so well to start with, which was to emancipate and put women on a relatively equal footing with males. I'm not sure that men and women are ever equal, but you know what I'm saying. And liberalism now needs a good yank backwards so that democracy, which is the interest of the majority and is an uneasy bedfellow with liberalism. The majority's interests often stand in opposition to the liberal interest. And they were good bedfellows when they're pushing and shoving and they're working quite well together. Liberalism's gone mad. Democracy has been shunted to one side. The reason free speech has been shut down is because free speech is a function of democracy. And if you have free speech, you might challenge someone's right to identify as a dog. And so you have to shut free speech down in the pursuit of liberalism. I just think the progression of the ideology in this country, the liberal democracy, where democracy and liberalism kind of tussled with each other to produce a good result, is no longer working. Democracy has been squashed and liberalism is on steroids. And we need to yank liberalism back to where it was in 1987, and where democracy, the majority's interests, are now promoted. We've got one hell of a struggle on our hands. The entire Western civilization, in my view, as I may have started by saying, I think faces an existential threat. Things have got much worse. People say things have to get worse before they get better. They've got really bad, haven't they? Things may yet get worse. Do not give up hope. We have to keep fighting this battle, and we have got MPs. We got 4 million votes. We're going to get money. The narrative's coming our way. We've got the Donald in the US of A who believes in borders, believes in ditching net zero, believes in ditching gender ideology, believes in lower taxation, believes in lower regulation. And we either respond to that as a nation, or we suffer even more. And we will respond to it as a nation. We are a great nation. Don't forget it. We are a great nation. We're a great people. The vote for Brexit was a scream from the British people to ditch globalism and put our country first. And that process is still ongoing. And we will still fight for it, and we will prevail. Absolutely we will. Yeah.
Okay, well, it just remains for me to thank you all for coming. Thank my fellow organisers, especially Marion, who organised this evening's event. And of course, there we are. And of course, our speaker, Ben. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff.
Good.